Marius is hosting this session, but I'd first like to say a word about how this project developed and what we're about, especially for those joining us for the first time today. When newly in his role as director of the Institute of Mennonite Studies at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, Jamie Pitts initiated a series of conversations about Anabaptists and philosophy and how to organize a forum for exploration of that intersection. First talking with Max Kennel, today's presenter, and then while at the Free University of Amsterdam with Marius van Hoogstraten, and later also with Kyle Gingrich-Hebert at the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center. As the global pandemic unfolded, the focus began to shift toward the possibilities an online forum might provide. In February 2021, an online symposium celebrating the publication of Marius's dissertation was held, and I had the honor of offering one of the responses to that complexly philosophical project. Those already mentioned here were all in attendance, and conversations among us following the event eventually birthed this roundtable. The five of us, Jamie, Max, Marius, Kyle, and I, function as its planning committee. The name for the roundtable, Anabaptists and Philosophy Roundtable, is intended to communicate the scope of this project, not narrowly focused on Anabaptist theology and philosophy only, though this relationship will surely be part of the explorations here. We're interested in how those connected to Anabaptist tradition have made use of and have seen and have understood philosophy in the broadest sense. This is an occasional and online roundtable. We're aiming for 3 to 4 sessions per year, but we don't have a rigid schedule. We are prioritizing hearing from people who've thought quite a bit about the relationship between Anabaptists and philosophy. But as a roundtable, we also wish to foster open discussion as a regular part of the sessions. We'd love to hear from you if you have ideas for speakers or respondents or other suggestions related to organizing the roundtable. We are grateful that each of us on the planning committee is supported by our institution or organization in doing this work. And so I'd like to take a moment to name the supporting institutions for the Anabaptists and Philosophy Roundtable. Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and the Institute of Mennonite Studies, where Jamie is, the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center, where Kyle is director, Pandora Press, where Max is director, the Amsterdam Mennonite Seminary, where Marius remains affiliated, and the Biblical and Religious Studies Division at Fresno Pacific University, where I am. Thank you again to all of you for joining us this morning. And with that, I'm turning things over to you, Marius.
Yes, good evening or good morning. My name is Marius van Hoogstraten, and I'm a postdoc at Mennonite Seminary in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I will be moderating this event. Before anything else, I just want to thank the team at TMTC for making it technically possible to meet in this way. That's Becca Smoot-Ens and Kyle Gingrich-Hebert, who are working in the background so that we can speak across the globe in this way, and it continues to fascinate me. Thank you. We have about an hour and a half together, and I will try to close punctually, just to respect everyone else's temporal commitments after this. So I'll try to conclude around 6:30 p.m. here. I imagine that's 12:30 where some of you may be, or 9:30, Laura, for you. Right. This event is being recorded, as I'm sure you've all noted, so you can moderate your contributions accordingly. It is my great joy to welcome our main speaker for today, who is Dr. Maxwell Kennel. Dr. Kennel received his PhD from McMaster University and is currently an SSHRC postdoctoral fellow in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Post-Secular History, Political Theology, and the Politics of Time, and the director at Pandora Press. He has given us a title for his talk with us today, Anabaptism contra Philosophy, on violence, enmity, and interdisciplinarity. Max, thanks for being here. I, for one, am very excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Marius, for that generous introduction, and I'll head straight to it. What does the Mennonite world have to do with the philosophical legacy of Athens, and what does the radical Reformation of the 16th century and its reception in the present have to do with the philosophical enlightenment of the 18th century and its many afterlives? These have been some of my research questions over the past several years, and so today I want to summarize and then extend my work on the topic by attempting to reconceptualize the relationship between the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition and its philosophical and secular insiders and outsiders. For there are secular and philosophical offshoots of the Anabaptist tradition that have not yet received adequate attention or analysis. But before saying anything new about the relationship between Anabaptism and philosophy, I'll take just a moment to summarize and point outward to my previous work on the topic. And I've pasted a link into the chat there with which collects some of these links so that you can access them. So in my 2017 article, Mennonite Metaphysics, I trace the history of Mennonites and philosophy, and I conclude by calling Mennonite theologians in particular to explore how the critique of violence that's characteristic of the tradition, how this might bridge the divide between Christianity and the secular, and even provide a way to see beyond this division entirely. For there are many ways that the boundary between secularity and Christianity is upheld by violent, forcible, or coercive means. And then a few years later, in 2020, I reformulated this call, in an entry update in the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia Online, the GAMEO. And in this entry on philosophy, where I update J. Lawrence Burkholder's entry, I conclude with a similar push toward pluralistic forms of interdisciplinarity for the discourse on Mennonites and philosophy. So I suggest that, from the philosophical affirmations of figures like Robert Friedman, J. Lawrence Burkholder, all the way to the contrast between A. James Reimer and John Howard Yoder's engagements with philosophy, up to recent discourses on pacifist epistemology and ontological peace, the history of Mennonites and philosophy is not characterized by clear distinctions between philosophical and theological positions, but by a series of entanglements and intersections. And these entanglements persist today in the work of Mennonite and Mennonite-related scholars, particularly those who challenge the notion that disciplinary divisions between philosophy and theology should decide the bounds of Mennonite identity or determine how faithfulness to that identity should be expressed. That was kind of the conclusion of that entry. And then last year, in the introduction to a special issue of the journal Political Theology, I argued even further that Mennonite political theology is at its very best when it turns toward, rather than away from its feminist, philosophical, secular, and literary minority traditions. And at the same time, in my dissertation, Ontologies of Violence, I argue for a complete reconceptualization of the concept of violence. And I draw from French philosophers like Jacques Derrida, Mennonite political theologians, and then from the late writings of feminist philosopher of religion, Grace Jansen, herself an ex-Mennonite of a sort. So in short, my dissertation argues that violence as a concept is best defined as the violation of value-laden boundaries. And furthermore, that any epistemology or ontology of violence needs to reckon with this key concept of, or this problem of displacement. This problem, I use displacement in that work to indicate that the assumption that differences will lead to enmity or antagonism or competition, oftentimes this assumption that differences will lead there can create the very problem that it fears. That's the dissertation. And then even more recently, and I see that Lauren Friesen is with us, in a book chapter on secular Mennonite social critique, I've summarized this research trajectory and extended a critique of historical and theological approaches to Mennonite studies. And this is in a book called Anabaptist Remix, which is due out in about 3 days. So in brief, my argument in that chapter is that neither the theologian's investment in the tradition nor the historian's detachment from it is sufficient for understanding or furthering the Anabaptist Mennonite critique of violence. And in that chapter, I'm very critical of recent movements in Mennonite theology that want to withdraw from articulating distinctive identity markers. And I also criticize disciplinary patterns in Anabaptist history that want to withdraw from normativity and critique. My approach to these problems is to articulate a form of secular Mennonite social critique that would proceed from distinctive Anabaptist and Mennonite values while taking up a very worldly and secular position that resists, mediates, and reformulates the distinction between Mennonite insiders and outsiders. And still more recently, in an article that will be published very soon in the Conrad Grable Review, I argue that Mennonites would do well to look outside of Christian theology and toward the work of post-humanist scholars in order to better understand technological life in this century. As I argue in my book, Post-Secular History, the prefix post should not be used to indicate movements of overcoming, where one gets past the past, but rather the prefix post, whether that's in post-secular or post-human, should refer to complex entanglements of the periodizing terms past, present, and future. So for Mennonites who are concerned with technology and its related post-human futures, the answer cannot be to double down on theological foundations and ignore the works of philosophers and critical theorists who have long worked on these topics. And this is because the worlds that Anabaptist and Mennonite theologians understand and seek to embody are always already enmeshed with political, philosophical, and secular ideas, many of which have decisively left Christianity behind, perhaps even for good reason. So in each of these contributions that I've just described, my underlying goal is to turn the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition outward toward engagement with other public and academic discourses, but also to spur an introspective turn inward toward reconsideration of the philosophical, ontological, epistemological consequences of pacifism. What does it mean to reject the use of violence, not only corporeally, in terms of bodies and actions, but also metaphysically, in terms of how we conceptualize the world and our relation to it? This opening of Mennonite studies toward its others leads me to the relationship between Anabaptism and philosophy. I want to open, following that summary, with a provocation by pointing toward a question that Ronald Thiessen asks in his forthcoming novel, Menno in Athens. The novel narrates the travels of a young Mennonite on the islands of Greece and stages what is likely the first sustained literary philosophical encounter between Mennonite and Greek thought. In a key moment in the book, the narrator asks his father a question. If you have the proclamation of truth in one case, and it's considered divine revelation, and the same proclamation is found in another culture, must we assume that one is divinely inspired and the other not? So in the context of this roundtable lecture series, we can put the question in a similar way. If there are resonant values that connect Anabaptist Mennonite identities with other secular or philosophical forms of life, then why would we dignify or attend to only one and not the other? The questions that Thiessen raises in his novel are at the heart of this series, where we place Anabaptist thought in dialogue with philosophy, asking how are we to treat the resonances and dissonances between Anabaptist Mennonite identities and the complex worlds of philosophy, and I would add secularity. The stakes of this question are very high because it concerns the relationship between one complex and diverse tradition and its many others. From one direction, we ought to consider how Mennonites and Anabaptists treat those who are outside their bounds. For this is the real test of whether the peace church traditions are who they say they are. Will those outside of it be treated in such a way that accords with the critique of violence in pursuit of peace that defines much of its interior? Or will violence be inscribed in subtle discursive ways as Anabaptists or Mennonites make instrumental use of philosophy or secretly suspect secularity of heresy? And then from the other direction, which I will not spend time on today, we could also ask whether representatives of Western philosophy really have it in them to treat religion seriously at all. Here, of course, I'm thinking of the Anglo-American analytic school, which struggles to dignify religious ways of thinking, by contrast with the continental school, which has been much more friendly to Christian theology, especially the continental philosophy of religion and political theology. But let's turn to the title of this lecture, Anabaptism contra philosophy. And let's ask if this joining term contra implies only difference or sheer contradiction. But this question is already a problem because Anabaptist Mennonite identities and the traditions of philosophy are both so interiorly diverse and complex that to place the two in dialogue without a significant preface seems irresponsible. And I mean irresponsible in the sense of not responding to what these names, philosophy and Anabaptist, only attempt to name. There are so many philosophies and philosophers that the term philosophy is already dishonest when it is used in a singular rather than plural form. And there are so many Anabaptists and Mennonites that to singularize such an identity feels violent, in the sense of violating the complexity and multiplicity of what names only ever attempt to name. How can we use these names, philosophy and Anabaptist, without contravening the anti-violent and peaceable aspirations of the tradition? So until we clarify what exactly we're comparing when we discuss Anabaptism contra philosophy, we cannot escape the problems of vagueness and generalization. Indeed, the relationship of representation between the individual, or between the relationship of representation where the one stands in for the many, this is an abstract philosophical problem, and the relationship between the individual and the community is a concrete social problem for the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. So it makes a lot of sense that these problems of representation, where abstract and singular terms stand in for complex and multiple realities, that these would be problems for any rapport between Anabaptism and philosophy. So for my purposes in this lecture, I will use the word philosophy to refer, for better and for worse, to the Western philosophical tradition, which traces its lineages from the Greeks to the Enlightenment and into modernity and postmodernity. On the other hand, I understand Anabaptist and Mennonite identities not as a strictly historical one, lodged in the 16th century, and not even as a strictly religious identity in the present. Instead, I see the Anabaptist vision, the spirit of the Radical Reformation, the Mennonite peace witness, as forms of life that both include and exceed institutional capture by the denominations of the church and the disciplines of the university. In answer to the question of how Anabaptists and philosophers ought to relate to each other, I propose simply that the way forward for this dialogue is to fully dignify both similarities and differences between the two, and to do so without the comforts of syncretistic unity or the paralyses of irreducible difference. So I first want to refuse the desire to collapse Anabaptist and philosophical identities into each other when we find similarities. Even when we find striking resonances between Anabaptist and philosophical ideas, as Thiessen does in his novel, there will always be real and irreducible differences between the two that cannot be subsumed into unity without an enormous cost to both sides. This reductive approach is also present when Mennonite theologians use philosophies and philosophers for their own purposes, without acknowledging that the philosophers they use would simply not agree with their aims. Secondly, and in reverse, I want to refuse the desire to see differences as only irreducible and incomparable. And this tendency is often present when we take recourse to specialization and defer to the differences between academic disciplines, as if to say, oh, I'm a theologian, therefore I don't need to read philosophy. Or, oh, I'm a historian and I don't need to read critical theory. No, there is no need to prohibit engagement with philosophy because it is so very different from Anabaptism. We should be able to think apart from the desire to collapse differences into sameness and think apart from the desire to make differences absolute or irreducible. Better to find a third way that is not between, but beyond these two bad options. So in the spirit of Anabaptism's refusal of and indebtedness to both Catholicism and Protestantism, I propose a third way that neither stands between nor entirely exits the supposed poles of Anabaptist thought and philosophy. To do this, I'm trying to develop a form of secular Mennonite social critique that uses the critique of redemptive violence to deconstruct rigid oppositions between religion and secularity, theology and philosophy, church and world. For none of these black and white distinctions are adequate to the complexities and entanglements of this life. Nowhere is there to be found a theologian without philosophical influence, or a philosopher without theological influence, or a churchgoer without a secular life, or a non-religious person purified of religious influence. We are not this or that. We are always both and neither. For nowhere except in the realm of ideal types is there a religious identity without secular enmeshments or a secular life without religious entanglements. This is why we are now both post-secular and post-religious. Now, beginning from the assumption that these terms, religious and secular, do not name stable phenomena, but instead are conceptual tools that are used and abused for diverse purposes, I want to critique the imposition of enmity, suspicion, and competition onto relationships between Anabaptism and its many others. One manifestation of this suspicion that I want to resist is found implicitly, I think, in the ignorance that many Anabaptist and Mennonite theologians have shown in regards to the worlds outside of Christian theology. Now, I use the term ignorance here in a very specific way to name a form of misrecognition and non-recognition. And this is because I believe that many Anabaptist and Mennonite theologians turn a blind eye to philosophical and secular thinkers who could otherwise be amazing partners and allies to think with. I'll point to 3 examples of this tendency and then develop my greater claim that the future of the Anabaptist encounter with philosophy ought to refuse simplistic distinctions between secularity and religion. Although I don't enjoy open criticism, here are 3 examples of how Mennonite scholars ignore those outside of their discourses and disciplines at the expense of their own stated values. So firstly, I see this ignorance in some forms of Anabaptist political theology. For example, the fascinating new collection, Anabaptist Political Theology After Marpeck, focuses on a historical figure, Marpeck, who was highly engaged in civil society. And yet the book is framed as if contemporary political theology is a purely Christian pursuit. Nowhere in the apparatus to the book or in its chapters is any acknowledgement that political theology is anything but Christian. This way of presenting the book ignores large areas in the discourse on political theology that do not consider themselves to be contributing to the aims of Christianity. For example, something like the Political Theology Network has gone to great lengths to present the paradigm of political theology as pluralistic and interdisciplinary, in a way that challenges the distinction between religion and secularity. So why would Anabaptist political theologies continue to use this term, political theology, without at least signaling that this term is not solely determined or owned by Christian theologians? Apart from 2 gestural quotations to Derrida and Zizek, there are no philosophers cited in the volume, and even more conspicuously, there is no engagement with major figures in the discourse on political theology, such as Giorgio Agamben and Vincent Lloyd or Adam Kotsko. Showing awareness of the existence of secular or semi-Christian political theologies should be a logical extension of the peace witness, because recognition and attention are often origin points of both peace and violence. Secondly, I see this as turning a blind eye toward philosophy and secularity in some Mennonite feminist theologies. A few years ago, in an article on Mennonite political theology and feminist critique, I challenged feminist theologians in the Mennonite tradition to consider how secular feminists might be both a resource and a challenge to their work. This past year, Susie Gunther Lowen generously responded to my article in her own excellent contribution to a special issue of political theology that I edited. Although she presented Mennonite feminist theologies in a brilliant and comprehensive way that will surely help the discourse, her article still limits to one footnote any consideration of Mennonite feminists who do not see themselves as Christians. I don't mean to pick on one representative of Mennonite feminist theology here, but I do wonder, why aren't Mennonite feminist theologians actively seeking potential secular allies who do not share their theological convictions, but who might share their values? Why not cite or intentionally form bonds of solidarity with philosophers like Diane Enns, literary figures like Miriam Taves or Casey Platt, or ex-Mennonites like Grace Jansen, when they are also engaged in deep critiques of patriarchy? And thirdly, I see this ignorance of philosophy and secularity in theologies that present Anabaptist and Mennonite identities as purely or ideally Christian, as if there were not Mennonites who retain their Mennonite identities after exiting the institutional church. For me, a striking example of an Anabaptist theology that misrecognizes secular Mennonite identity is Leighton Boyd Friesen's new book, Secular Nonviolence and the Theodrama of Peace. In the book, Friesen continues a tired pattern of seeing secularity as a threat to Christianity and something Christianity must resist. For Friesen, when Mennonites exit the church but retain a commitment to nonviolence, there's something fundamentally lacking. He writes that, quote, "To the extent that the Mennonite pacifist ethic is not a theological ethic, it will fail to provide a coherent wisdom for how to live in this world." I contend that this is patently false. There are many Anabaptists and Mennonites who understand themselves to be heirs of the tradition, but do not see that identity as something that exists for the sake of the church, and whose expressions of pacifism are not at all incoherent. There are scholars who identify deeply with the tradition while rejecting its ecclesial and institutional expressions. For example, Daniel Schenck Kruz's secular Mennonite social critique in his book, Queering Mennonite Literature, is a great example where he argues that Anabaptist informed values like community and mutual aid are important, but he does not do so for the sake of the capital C church. My question is, why not acknowledge and recognize that the Anabaptist tradition has deep and rich secular afterlives in the present that deserve just as much consideration and dignity as its theological inheritors? For example, we can look to the entire discourse on Mennonites writing. Why not see this discourse as a legitimate and faithful expression of Mennonite identity that follows the spirit of Anabaptist radicalism and dissent by exiting established ecclesial bounds? What would it mean to repent and turn away from such a myopic vision of Anabaptism and instead listen closely to the voices of ex-Mennonites, near-Mennonites, and non-Mennonites and their social critiques? I suppose that my greater question when I encounter these limitations is, why do theological Anabaptists struggle to engage with secular and philosophical thinkers without either using philosophy as a tool for Mennonite purposes or anxiously returning to a set of rigid foundations in face of perceived secular threat? When contemporary Mennonites repeat Menno Simon's favorite verse, "For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid in Jesus Christ," from 1 Corinthians 3:11, it bears considering what work the image of a foundation is doing here in relation to those who do not share the same foundations. Do those in the Anabaptist or Mennonite traditions conceive of such a foundation in Christ as something to anxiously return to in the face of perceived threats? Or does founding oneself or one's tradition on a peaceful figure like Jesus of Nazareth, does this mean divesting from all investments that would cause such an anxious return? I use language of investment and divestment here because it bears considering what exactly it would cost those in the Anabaptist tradition to engage more fully with philosophical and secular thinkers, beyond accusations of inadequacy or instrumental use. But even beyond this important question, we can push our dialogue further by asking if there really is a cost or a risk or a threat at all when Anabaptists engage with philosophers. I simply do not think that there is. It would cost Mennonite theologians nothing to engage with the work of philosophers or secular political theologians without subsuming them into theology or seeing them as lacking or irreducibly different. Against the false promises of safety, security, and certainty that foundations tend to make, I suggest that if the Anabaptist Mennonite community is truly committed to the critique of violence in pursuit of peace, whether that comes from the Gospels or not, then a critical reconceptualization of interdisciplinarity is essential, lest we allow suspicion, fear, and reactivity to define the terms of our encounters with others. To do this, we need only take seriously that great insight from Walter Wink, which has been so well received by Mennonites, and that is the critique of redemptive violence. Wink's insight is simply that attempting to solve the problem of violence by using violence, it doesn't work. Neither does passivity or quietism. In response to the problem of evil, both passivity and violence are inadequate. It is not only morally reprehensible to respond to one violation with another, it is also descriptively ineffective. This means that the critique of redemptive violence is both descriptive in nature, because it describes how violence doesn't sustainably solve the problems it hopes to solve, but it also has a normative character, because it suggests that meeting violence with more violence is morally wrong. I want to push this argument further by using it to challenge the distinction between religion and secularity, and the more specific division between Anabaptism and philosophy, divisions that do not accurately divide up the world. So why would we continue to essentialize the distinction between religion and secularity beyond its contextual and domain-specific uses? So when this distinction between religion and secularity is used in peaceful and deferential ways, where we defer to those who say that they're religious or secular and believe what they say they are, then I think these terms are very helpful. But as soon as the distinction between religion and secularity is used to promote suspicion or enmity, as soon as it becomes categorical, it loses its usefulness for understanding identity and becomes a tool for enforcing it and policing it, thereby contravening the best insights of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. Beyond the problems of violence within the distinction between religion and secularity, the critique of violence also refuses to be captured by that distinction. Rather than being a solely religious or solely secular set of values, the critique of violence and accompanying desire for justice and peace, this is a bridge across our artificial distinctions. We can picture it as a sort of grid. On the top, there are values-driven critiques of violence that are normative. And there are theological values-driven critiques of violence, like traditional forms of Christian pacifism that would reject violence out of adherence to Jesus Christ. But there are also secular, non-religious, values-driven critiques of violence. And I'm thinking of recent works by Adriana Cavarero, Judith Butler, and Bonnie Honig, which advance critiques of violence, not from a theological perspective, but from a philosophical one. But there are also, below on the grid, effectiveness-driven critiques of violence that make descriptive claims, like Walter Wink's critique of redemptive violence in Engaging the Powers, or in a book like Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stefan's Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. So I present this grid not because I think things are really divided up in this way, but because it's a helpful heuristic for thinking about how entangled secularity and religion are with each other when it comes to the rejection of violence. Even Walter Wink's critique of redemptive violence, it doesn't fit in the grid so well because it's defined by both his values in a normative way, but also his descriptive claim that violence doesn't work. So rather than solidify this in a diagram, my point is that there ought to be sympathetic bonds of solidarity and connection across secularity and religion, across Anabaptism and philosophy. Also that we could see the critique of violence as a secular as a post-secular and post-religious opportunity. I'm interested in coalitional responses to the problem of violence that combine rather than oppose secular and religious ways of thinking. And I hope that Anabaptist and Mennonite thinkers can be part of this. However, this will not be possible if disciplinary boundaries remain stable, or worse, remain defined by irreducible difference or suspicion or opposition. I fear that maybe the most basic reason why Mennonite political theologians or feminist theologians or Christian theologians turn away from secular and philosophical voices is perhaps fear. Maybe a kind of fear that leads to knee-jerk reactions and rejections of threatening ideas. I've seen these fears play out in personal and professional conversations. And in these conversations, when I stray too far into uncomfortable philosophical or secular territory, I notice that many theologians become anxious and insist upon returning to the foundation laid by Jesus Christ. Perhaps this kind of conversation is familiar to you, or perhaps not. I find that when I push Mennonite theologians toward philosophical and secular thinkers or ideas, the response is often to redouble and return to basic principles, such as the founding figure of Jesus Christ or the foundational institution of the church. Most explorations of secular and philosophical thinkers by Mennonites tend to conclude in this way, as if assuring the writer and the reader that even though we have looked outside of theology for a little while, we are still safely inside it. All to say that I am interested in why some Anabaptists and Mennonites respond to philosophical and secular ideas as threats, even when there are no real threats to be found. The desire for peace and justice and the critique of violence is a major bridge that can span the divide between Anabaptism and philosophy, and between secular and Christian representatives of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. But this bridge threatens to collapse when Christian fragility causes a retreat to first principles, rather than a true form of recognition and connection. It costs Anabaptists and Mennonites nothing to read, listen to, dignify, acknowledge, engage with, and cite philosophers. There is no threat lurking in the background that would perhaps destabilize Christian convictions if secular or philosophical perspectives were fully recognized, dignified, and given voice. In fact, I think that the real threat to Anabaptist and Mennonite values, from the peaceful Christ to the Anabaptist vision, is in the act of ignoring the other and in the damaging forms of non-recognition that are used to keep the line between religion and secularity stable. So it's the politics of recognition that's at the core of my argument here. My argument for an anti-violent form of interdisciplinarity between Anabaptism and philosophy. I wonder, is there not an implicit form of enmity and even epistemological violence in the desire to maintain hard boundaries between disciplines and discourses, like Christian theology or philosophy, or religion and secularity? On one hand, these boundaries are important when we want to identify real differences in particular contexts. At the same time, when these distinctions are reified, they become self-reinforcing and prevent the kinds of mutual recognition that motivate their positive uses. The real problem underneath this distinction between differences we should dignify and differences that become self-reinforcing is the subtle violence of non-recognition. So to refer to a philosopher, as one should do in such a roundtable, I'll point to the way that Alexander Garcia Duttman conceptualizes recognition. He writes that, quote, someone wants to be recognized as this or that because they claim to be this or that. Recognition must establish and confirm an identity. By constituting and authenticating an identity, recognition is meant to incorporate a contingent I or self into the community of a deeply rooted we. A we firmly anchored and clearly positioned. The one who recognizes is both a witness and a producer. They belong to the presupposed community or society which must first be formed by recognition. But recognition never forms such a society or community, given that the very moment it tries to unite what it produces and what it witnesses, it must indicate its own splitting into reception and spontaneity, confirmation and establishment, witnessing and producing. All to say that Duttman thematizes recognition by showing how it's essential for identity, while also showing how recognition performs a paradoxical task of uniting what cannot be united. So too, with the disposition of recognition I am proposing for the relationship between Anabaptism and philosophy. Some toxic forms of recognition instrumentalize the other, as in the case of theologians who take up philosophical ideas and use them for Christian purposes in ways that their philosophical originators would not recognize. This is often a form of misrecognition. On the other hand, there are toxic forms of non-recognition that occur when we turn away from or refuse to recognize or dignify adjacent identities, who may even share our priorities. For example, when theologians proceed as if all Mennonites think of themselves as Christians, or when theologians define the secular as an absence rather than a form of life with positive values, then deep misrecognition has occurred. But Duttman's insight is even deeper, because it shows us that the communities that engage in recognition, both producing identity and witnessing it, these communities are never unified, never whole. Recognition tries to unite what it produces and what it witnesses, but it ultimately reflects our divided and alienated character. We are not one, we are not whole, and we do not agree. Better to acknowledge this and then find deep bonds of solidarity across difference, rather than take refuge in fantasies of unity, or as Miranda Joseph calls it, the romance of community. So if the paradoxes of recognition are the problem for the dialogue between Anabaptists and philosophers, as I've claimed, then what are the solutions? The first solution, I contend, is just to cultivate a richer and more generous practice of recognition. Not recognition that self-assuredly gives the other the gift of attention, and not recognition that ironically prides itself in vulnerability or patience, but a form of recognition that is mutual enough that it could leave behind the shorelines of theological and historical comfort for a very long time and set out on the seas of secularity without promise of return. This form of recognition would allow Anabaptists and philosophers to engage with each other's ideas without anxiety, without agenda, without suspicion. Rather than even seeing recognition in competitive terms, where identities in the marketplace of ideas are pitted against each other, as if we could only pay attention to one thing at a time. Rather than that, we need to challenge the reactive and zero-sum ways that we conceive of attention itself. As I argue in my dissertation, the first step toward a rapport between secular and religious critics of violence is to challenge the idea that difference will always lead to displacement. We lose nothing by engaging fully and openly with that which is different from us. And we gain a deeper sense of our own identities and communities when, in the words of both Grace Jansen and Audre Lorde, when we cease to see difference as dangerous. But the way forward on this front about seeing difference as dangerous, this is more difficult because our response to difference is conditioned not only by our theologies and histories, but by our psychology and biography. As Christian Earley and his colleagues note, following the work of John Bowlby, our attachment relationships, often formed in early childhood, these determine our ability to form peaceable bonds across lines of difference. As Christian and Anne-Marie Earley write in their introduction to this fascinating volume, Integrating the New Science of Love and a Spirituality of Peace from 2013, the fundamental way that humans and other animals deal with stress is through social connection and not competition. So the question for Anabaptists and philosophy should be, what stands in the way of real connection across difference? Christian and Anne-Marie Earley furthermore argue that there are deep resonances between Anabaptist peace theologies and the psychology of attachment, and I agree. If the notion that difference is dangerous is what keeps Anabaptists suspicious of philosophy and secularity, then the solution is not to fine-tune our theologies or double down on our foundationalism, but to examine the deeper reasons why we react to differences as if they will displace us. This is why I've found insight in my spouse's field of study in counseling psychology, and I look to the framework of internal family systems therapy for help in trying to understand the desire to partition and divide what is really entangled and connected. I'll just gesture to that in conclusion, because I think that the real stakes of the relationship between disciplines and identities is best understood by looking inward at the reasons why we construct identity and otherness in the first place. This is why I'm very glad that the first lecture in this series by Diane Enns was so autobiographical. For how else do we encounter how else do encounters between Anabaptism and philosophy occur than in life? I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to Christian Earley's response.
Yes, thank you so much, Max. You've really given us a fascinating piece and a lot to think about. Before we enter into discussion with each other and with you, Max, and I'm sure many of you already have questions and comments ready, we will hear a response from our second speaker, who is Dr. Christian Earley. Dr. Earley received his PhD from the University of Wales and is currently an associate professor of philosophy at James Madison University. He has written and published and taught extensively on philosophy and religion, including ethics and faith and reason and Alistair MacIntyre and much more. Dr. Earley, it's really a great joy to welcome you here, and I look forward to your comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marius, and thank you, Max. I gotta say, this was incredibly stimulating, and I confess to Max, my response is going to be in the mode of yes and. I'm not going to try to push back on what Max is doing, because I wholeheartedly agree with what he's trying to do. In fact, that's what sort of animated my own work, and still does, and sort of provided me with a vision for what one might do as intellectual work, and where I might contribute. So these ideas are central to how I have perceived what needs to be done, and I only commend you for articulating them so clearly. And I also just want to say, I love that you open up the affective register and psychology right at the end, because I fundamentally, again, just agree with you that in order to work on something like the problems of difference, or the problems of the relationship between Anabaptism and philosophy, however you define those two, you're going to have to work on yourself, which means that it's the uncomfortable stuff of seeing inside, and what is it that is unconsciously driving some of these responses, such as the fear response or anxiety. And how does that then show up in the ways in which I am reacting and protecting my reaction philosophically or theologically, running back to source, running back to the safety of the tradition, in order to reestablish and reaffirm my own identity, which is all just sort of self-protective work. And if we could own that, then I think a new space for conversation might come up, one that is in that area of a third way, realizing that it's uncomfortable, and that we give up the assurance of where we're going to end up if we allow the wave of conversation to pick us up. Where is it going to put us down? I have no idea. And that requires a kind of stance on the inside, which I think you are articulating and naming really, really well. One of my complaints with, I'll just say Mennonites, has been that there's no real psychology there. It's as if the inner world doesn't exist. So the fact that you are courageous enough to open up that conversation, my hat goes off to you. And all I can say is I'm right there with you. So what I'll do is I'll structure my comments just sort of as they have occurred to me, and they will be more in terms of opening up lines for conversation to sort of start teasing some of these things out, which I hope that we will then pursue as it opens up to the whole roundtable. First of all, yes, beginning to think about the relationship between Anabaptism, and by the way, I really like that you say Anabaptism and not Mennonites, because I would want to clarify that for me, I grew up in Copenhagen, and there are no Mennonites in Denmark. They're just south of the border in Germany, but they aren't there in Scandinavia. And my introduction to the Anabaptist tradition was simply by being convinced that either this was a game of coercion and violence, or there was some other way of articulating an epistemological project of invitation, following after, that I saw embodied in Jesus, that was convincing to me that this could be one way of engaging Nietzsche, whom I had been reading and was thrown by. So just to say, I much prefer Anabaptism because I can be in that rather than Mennonites. I'm not genetically one, and I will never be one. And they know it. They've always known it. They sniff it out first thing. Anyway, so Anabaptism and philosophy is a super important subject area. I think here we are dealing with the poverty of our tradition. I mean, if you look at the Catholic tradition, there is a rich, rich, rich engagement and history of just engagements with Aristotle and Aquinas, and you think of all of the work that they have done to clarify and articulate their tradition, which is really beautiful and for some of us very persuasive. Protestants maybe a little bit less, leaning often on Kant, leaning often on Hume, depending on which Protestant you're dealing with, although they seem to have rediscovered Aristotle. So that's good for them. But what do we do with Anabaptists? And I think your word entanglement is probably correct. I can see drawing on Heidegger's critique of technology, looking at ways of being in the world, who we are as human beings and how that shapes our way of knowing. I can see that. I can see what my teacher, Nancy Murphy, talked about as postmodern Anglo-American philosophy. So postmodern meaning after Quine, after Wittgenstein, looking at forms of life and language, rejecting foundationalism, which of course is, that could be a point of contention. So neither one of those, probably either on the continental side or on the Anglo-American side, is probably something that an Anabaptist would want to hop into and adopt. And I can also see a conversation with followers of Nietzsche and Foucault around issues of power and unmasking of power. Walter Wink would be was sort of in that stream. And so entanglements is probably correct. I have worked some with William Connolly, in his political philosophy. And what I really like about his use of Nietzsche is, again, he opens up the affective register, because with Nietzsche, you get to identify the work of what resentment does, resentment for your condition. And that becomes really important in how you deal with difference, which is a central concern of yours. How do you respond to difference? Are you fundamentally resentful that you have to explain yourself, or are you trying to eliminate difference because you experience it as a threat to your own being in the world? So a kind of radical pluralism he draws on William James as well, the American pragmatic tradition. So all of those I can see as sort of openings for ways in which Anabaptists could engage philosophy and really gain depth and insight and clarity into their own work. I don't know where to put this in my comments, but you mentioned, and I think this is critical, what is the relationship between a particular way of life and the doctrinal commitments that it might have, or the convictions that it might have? And so this comes up in the question of, do you have to have Christian convictions or pacifist convictions in order to sustain a Christian way of life? Is it possible to live your way peacefully, but not have any substantive convictions about a Trinity or God or anything like that? And you see Anabaptists or Mennonites who have grown up in that tradition, who, like you were saying, they're sort of leaving that tradition and they're finding that perfectly possible. And others saying, no, that's not sustainable. You have to maintain a sort of a doctrinal commitment in order to sustain that way of life. And I have to date not seen any persuasive argument for the necessary connection between, let's say, Trinitarianism or creedal conception of God and a pacifist way of life. So the fact that you identify that as an intellectual problem, but also as a source of discovery, I think is super important. And that's a whole line of direction that this conversation could go. What are the central questions here? Well, how do we define violence? And I sort of gave you a heads up that I'm slightly intrigued by your definition of violence as a violation of value-laden boundaries. I want some examples. What in the world do you mean by that? And one thing that I have worked on is a critique of empire. Lots of other people have done that, but sort of the possibilities of being able to map the world with pacifist convictions or coming from a place of peace. What does that mean? What do we hope for in teleology, in eschatology? Where is this thing going? Do you have to give up a sense of control of where this conversation is going to end? Is that what is necessarily implied in a commitment to pacifism? And that then raises a question of what, in fact, is the relationship between a commitment to peace and a commitment to Christianity? How deep does your commitment to peace go? Will you allow it to shift your understanding of what you mean by God? And that's sort of at the heart of the whole thing. How deep does pacifism go? I'm intrigued by your use of the term metaphysical, a rejection of metaphysical violence. I kind of want to say yes to that, but I want to know a little bit more about what you mean by that. So that's one thing. How do we conceive of violence? What do we mean by pacifism? How deep does that conviction go? Do we allow it to tinker with our notions of God? And then, of course, how do we conceive of difference? I mentioned resentment and opening up the psychological register and naming fear and anxiety as some of the things that may be motivating there, which I think is super critical in order to get any traction on this. And I love the fact that you're suspicious of distinctions, and I think they're ultimately unhelpful. I mean the distinction between secular and religious, church and world, in and out, philosophy and theology. I think all of those serve in a sense to protect us from instead opening up to a real conversation, because, like you said, we want to double down on identity and are afraid of where the conversation might take us if we really just let go. What else do I want to say? Yes to your call for a richer and more generous practices of recognition, an acceptance of our condition as in the midst of a conversation that could potentially challenge our central convictions. I mean, this is where Quine comes up again. This is where McIntyre comes up again. Difference, for me, difference is the necessary condition within which you get to challenge your core convictions. How else are you going to know whether your convictions are ultimately true if you don't conversationally put them to the test? But that then will require that you can't be assured that you will come out the same on the other side after you engage the conversation. What Quine would say is our web of beliefs is underdetermined. We have no idea how we are going to resolve some of these problems. And the lockdown on we have to end up with the Nicene Creed on the other side of this, I just think is fundamentally mistaken. We have no idea where we're going to end. Finally, or just to say, that here we get into issues such as incommensurability. So dealing with a rival tradition or another tradition that we fundamentally don't understand what in the world they're trying to say, and we can't translate their convictions and their speech into something that is familiar to us. Now, how to deal with incommensurability is itself a whole nother subject, and I don't want to open that up here, but we can talk about it later. And then finally, you mentioned the book that Anne-Marie and I did, which was the result of a conference. And the response to that was, but there isn't any theology in here. And that just sort of is exactly the problem that you're naming. There was a sort of an unwillingness to sit with a psychological theory long enough to challenge us and to sort of help us to articulate maybe better or see resonances or differences, whatever it is. And at the outset, it was just, there's just not enough theology. And no, we didn't run to the tradition there. We rather wanted to open up conversations and build bridges, which is, so anyway, I just want to say yes to what you're trying to do, and I'm right there with you. But that for me also opens up a conversation around evolution. And one of the problems that I have thought about in terms of Anabaptist ethics is, how do we understand our environment? Do we experience human nature or who we are as human beings as fundamentally something that we ought to resist? do we think of nature as fundamentally competitive and violent? And my argument would be to say, well, no, and let's just sort of open up that conversation a little bit more and hear what evolution has to say and engage that. And fundamentally, it makes sense to me that, I mean, here's the marvel. This is what I think is actually incredible. Life has found a way in human beings where the only really way to sustain life is to love each other, which is to say that love has become a survival practice. You just don't get human beings if you don't have that mother-infant connection or mothering one, whatever that connection. That doesn't need to be mother as such, but that fundamental human connection, because we learn who we are in conversation with someone else, which is, I think, exactly what you're talking about here. So that's really all I have to say. It's a big yes and from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. Marius, may I respond briefly before?
Yeah, I was going to ask you before I open up the floor, if you want to respond to a couple of the specific points, and then.
No, I'd like to, and I won't be too long, but I'll move through systematically. I first like your response, Christian, because of its structure as yes and. I feel like, if we're looking for any kind of pacifist epistemology, it should probably start with a yes and, not in a way that would prohibit us from saying no. I'm trying to learn a new practice of saying a hard no to things, not in a way that prohibits or shuts down further conversation, but in a way that makes difference clear. So thank you. I appreciated your noting that this giving up of assurance of where we'll end up, and I agree with you. I think that can only come from an inner stability. And we cannot achieve any sort of inner stability by this outward discourse. It requires an inwardness that wherein we would clearly face our fears and anxiety and our propensity for protectiveness. It was great to hear about you engaging Nietzsche as an Anabaptist, and I want to recommend Robert Friedman's Design for Living, where he does something similar, and it's those intersections are precisely the ones that I'm calling for. And I agree with you that there is an enormous philosophical poverty in the Anabaptist tradition. However, I've been alerted to much deeper and richer resources, especially in the Dutch context in the 18th century. And I don't read Dutch. I'm not a trained historian in that respect, but there are many resources there that I think could create excellent new research directions. And I also agree with you about these connections between resentment and difference. I think that our response to difference, when it takes the form of resentment, causes incredible political complexities. My postdoctoral project is on conspiracy theories, religion, and critique, and resentment shows up there in large and small ways. So I just want to flag that. But I'll respond to your three kind of questions very briefly. The first is about the definition of violence, and you asked for an example. So in my dissertation and in its current process of revision, I'm conceptualizing violence as the violation of value-laden boundaries. And that tries to account for the subjectivity of the term, that what I call violence and what you call violence will be different. There can be no singular or objective definition, but there can be a sort of a meta-methodological definition as violation. And then we get these conflicts of narratives and meta-narratives about what are the boundaries that are then violated. But an example for me, one of the most salient is abuse, the cycle of abuse, but also the troubled distinction between physical and psychological abuse, where in physical abuse is very often, it's something you can see, it's empirically verifiable in some ways, whereas psychological abuse is much harder to, something like gaslighting, much harder to define. But I think we lose ourselves when we make a hard distinction between the two, as if, one is, physical abuse is legitimate and easy, singularizable and identifiable, whereas psychological abuse is subjective and you can say, and anyway, that is an example of a violation. And it illuminates the complexities of such violations, wherein some practices, some work environments or relationships can involve violations that would be violations for someone in their context and person, but the very same practices could not at all be violent to another. And that just opens up into complexities that I think any critic of violence, religious or secular or both, needs to reckon with. And for that, I would point outward to Judith Butler's recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, where she deals with that problem. The second question you had was about pacifism. And I really liked how you put that. I think there is a high degree of necessity for Christian critiques of violence to be able to against themselves, to redouble against themselves, to allow and push for a questioning of the foundations from which they themselves proceed. And I think that this requires what my supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, Travis Craker, sometimes calls a critique of possessive desire, wherein this desire to lock it down and to achieve safety, security, and certainty, it just doesn't work. It's not morally defensible, but it's also just not workable. And I think that's a critique that ought to be duly upheld. You can draw from Jesus Christ, from the Gospels for that, or you can draw from the prohibition on idolatry for that, but you don't need to. And as soon as those sources ossify or crystallize, then they've become self-defeating. And then the second last question you had was about metaphysical violence. You want to, and I deal with that in detail in my dissertation, but I think two examples will help us. One manifestation of metaphysical, ontological, or epistemological violence is essentialization. This notion that we have an identity that is one thing, or we have an institution or a church or a group that is whole. And then there becomes this secondary policing behavior that says, well, as soon as difference occurs, as soon as there's any fracturing, then that needs to be subsumed back into the whole. So I think we must be fundamentally suspicious of any form of essentialization that would try to fix in space and time an identity or essence. And then number two, another example that comes up a lot in the second chapter of my dissertation, where I'm dealing with dialogues between Mennonites and John Milbank, is in teleology, which you've already alluded to. And that is, as soon as we think that the essence of a thing has a telos toward which it must adhere, we've already lost, right? We've already become self-defeating and worked against the best insights of at least the Anabaptist tradition, I think. So those are two metaphysical violences: essentialization and a kind of fixity upon certain teleologies. And then the last thing that you brought up, I think, is perhaps the most important, and that is difference in our attitudes toward difference. And here I'm going to paste into the chat a link to an article I wrote on internal family systems therapy, which is a brilliant way of conceptualizing the self as multiple. And it accounts, I think, in a way that has a lot of explanatory power for why we want to dissociate, to disconnect mind and body, or philosophy and biography. And so you brought up Heidegger, and I think you bring up Heidegger in the right spirit. But first thing I think of when I hear about using his critique of technology is that I would not want to dissociate his political and biographical violences from his philosophy, and that's the case all across the board. So the more we can resist dissociation, reform those connections, not from a standpoint of moral purism, none of us have clean hands, but to at least make those connections, the better. And then your last point was on ecology and nature, and I'm reading this book by Malcolm Ferdinand called Decolonial Ecology. It's extremely challenging to me, and so that's a growing edge for me, and that's all I can say about that, because I have mountains of reading to do. Thank you for your generous response, and I'll hand it back to Marius for questions.
Yes, well, Thank you both for starting the conversation in this way. We have about 13 minutes in which I want to open the floor for additional comments and questions directed both at Dr. Earley and at Max. Please use the raise hand function, and if you're unable to speak into the camera, you can also paste your, you can also write a question into the chat, and we'll try to bring it into the conversation. I do want to ask you all to be a little bit succinct, and I want to establish now that if your question or comment goes on for very long, I may interrupt you and ask you to conclude. I see Ernie Ham. Please. Yep.
Hi. Thanks very much for the talk, Maxwell, and for the comment, Christian. I'm an historian of science, intellectual historian, science and technology studies person, just to let you know where I'm coming from. And I think, with respect to your comment, Christian, about evolution, I mean, there is a rich tradition. It goes back at least to Piotr Kropotkin of seeing evolution in terms of and survival of the fittest in terms of cooperation. I mean, it is a very narrow one to see it in this competition way. It wasn't really clear that even Darwin formulated it in that sense. It's more of a Spencerian reading, but that's a kind of side point. I think that there's so many interesting things to say. I think Max, in your account, I mean, it's formulation of Anabaptism, Mennonitism, Anabaptism, whatever. The two words that frequently and almost always come up are peace and justice. And of course, who could be against that? Because what are you in favor of if you're against it? Violence and injustice? Well, of course not. But the case can be made that that those things are in fact not essential to Anabaptism. Maybe they're add-ons, maybe they're peripheral, and they've only become essential in recent years. And that, you could certainly make the argument that community and voluntarism, for example, are even more important and more fundamental, if you want to use that kind of language, and they would lead into very different kinds of discussions and about what Anabaptism is and how it connects to much longer traditions of Christian thought. I mean, I think that, as Christian pointed out, there's a very rich Catholic tradition of engaging with Aristotle. It goes back to at least Aquinas. Certainly older even than that, go back to Augustine, if you will. But just that there are other things. That's enough from me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for that connection. And I think that's an important criticism. Throughout, I am returning persistently to peace and justice as major identity markers. And again, I risk contravening my own criticisms by essentializing the tradition in that way. I do wonder about community and voluntarism, how one could have community and voluntarism without an implicit critique of the violence of its opposite, but I'll leave it there.
I have a question from Beola Paul. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So please unmute yourself, because I don't think I can do that from here. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I am Beola Paul, and I'm not Mennonite, but my background is Christian. 4 things I want to note, take away from me. Returning violence with violence is morally wrong. I've heard that. I needed to know for certain. And then over and over, you talked about Jesus Christ. I loved it because I've been in other Mennonite sessions. And at the end of it, if I'm not a Christian, the word Jesus Christ doesn't come up. So what is this all about to somebody outsider? But you mentioned Jesus Christ many times. I commend you for that. And then you said, we must conclude with the Nicene Creed. Wonderful. Oh, you said no? Okay.
I believe that was Christian Earley, and I think he was challenging that a little bit, but please go on.
All I meant was you stuck to me, what is fundamentally Christian, because I'm not a Mennonite. That came through strongly, that to me, yes, you're Anabaptist and Mennonite, but underneath is Christ. There's this philosophy being propagated, but that came out strongly. That's what I'm saying. I commend you for that Christ's philosophy is the bottom line of
Thank you
whatever.
for your commendation. May I respond briefly?
Yes.
So I've been reading this biography of Jesus of Nazareth by Dorothy Zola and Louis Chartreux, and they make an intriguing point that the co-authors there, it's a feminist biography of Jesus in the last chapter, and they want to distinguish clearly between Jesus and this kind of use of Jesus Christ as a, for instrumental purposes. And so I'll just return to the comment I made, and Christian made it in a different way, that, if you have that commitment to Jesus Christ, it ought to be able to cause you to challenge itself.
Yeah.
So if we're going to persistently return to that, then that ought to be a form of self-critique. But I appreciate your response. Thank you.
And just one more, love, and you equated to the motherhood. I'm a mother, grandmother. So that is simple. I loved it. It's motherhood in you, just the act of giving when there's a need.
That was Christian again, pointing to
Yes.
motherhood. And I would point then out further to Grace Jansen, Jantzen, for whom in her late work, natality, the fact that we are born,
Yes.
has more possibilities for sociality than what she calls, this fixation on mortality. We're very death obsessed. We want to just shore off death. And so, she's an incredible resource who can cut across, again, this religious secular division and point to motherhood and mothering as a positive resource for us. So thank you.
Thank you. It is full of gems. I really appreciate, and I'm glad I was here today. Thank you.
I see no other raised hands. It's the danger as a moderator, you say, please be succinct, and then everyone. I was like, well, actually, my comment's not that important. But I would like to take the opportunity maybe to ask a question myself, if I may, Max. So I was, at the danger of reiterating what Ernie Ham just said, I wonder if, so you speak to the Mennonites who aren't Christians, and I remember a conversation between Miriam Toews and Fernando Enns when she came to speak here in Hamburg, and there were these two battling ideas, and one of my takeaways from this conversation is that obviously there are Mennonites who aren't Christians, and that challenged me as a pastor at the time. But I wonder, and this is my question, if the exclusively or specifically theological or Christian version of Anabaptism is perhaps also more inclusive in a way, specifically towards those Mennonites and those Anabaptist Christians who aren't from a Mennonite or Anabaptist background.
Could you just reframe that, like one more sentence? I'm just having trouble understanding.
I think, well, is there a danger that this idea of Mennonites who aren't Christians refers specifically, or is available specifically to those who have a Mennonite background, and is not something you can join? It's something you have to be born as.
Oh yeah, I mean,
the theological version you can, and the more important, let's say, Jesus is or God is in Anabaptist identity, the more open it is to those who aren't called Enns or Toews to join.
Oh, I mean, thank you, Marius. I can totally see how the secular Mennonite identity could just reaffirm some kind of genetic thing. And so, I mean, I'm going to paste into the chat a little piece I wrote on Miriam Toews when she came to McMaster, where I'm trying to develop this in more detail. And I would want the secular Mennonite identity to be just as open. That's a normative claim, of course. I couldn't say that would be how that identity would be received. But I hear you, and I think voluntarism and the self-identification ought to have the last word in both cases. Whether one wants to join a Mennonite church without the kind of typical last names, or whether one wants to adopt traditionally Mennonite or Anabaptist values without having any background in the tradition. I'd want to leave both open. I see that Jamie has his hands up.
Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Thanks, everyone. In the interest of time, I'll try to make this question very quick. You say that there's no cost to giving up or to engaging fully with secular thought. I think could be probed what fully means there. it seems like there are costs to engage your fears, to engage your anxieties, and to give up communities formed on the basis of those fears and anxieties, and use the language of values repeatedly. My understanding is that that term has been introduced, kind of the modern understanding of that term can be traced at least one source to Nietzsche, trying to show us the material basis for our convictions, the economic interest that is laden in those. And there are economic material bases for those, or at least conditions for some of these more exclusivist kind of perspectives that you're criticizing. And embracing your approach could mean giving those up. And that is anxiety producing in itself. So I just wonder about the material costs.
Jamie, that's such an irony, right? Like this, that if I'm at once claiming that there is no real cost, but also calling for divestment. And so I think that maybe the linchpin here is what one thinks costs will be related to what one values. And so I am calling for a certain transvaluation of values wherein we would stop thinking that, you know, this fulsome engagement that neither instrumentalizes nor fully boundaries philosophy. I am making a normative claim that although it may feel like we're losing something, we are not. That we gain immeasurably more from fulsome engagement with difference. But you're right. You're absolutely right to say that, like, if we follow that line of thinking and what I'm arguing for, there will be an enormous cost. But I suppose what I'm arguing is that whatever that cost is, it's worth giving up for what's on the other side. But thank you for pointing that out. There's one of those interior contradictions.
Thanks.
So at this point, thank you all. I see, Jamie, maybe you can take down your hand, or feel free to. Thank you all. At this point, I would come to a conclusion. Thank you all so much for joining us for this. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Dr. Earley, and thank you for all of you for engaging with these ideas and these thoughts, and for joining us here. Max, if you have any concluding remarks, I want to give you the final opportunity to utter them.
My only conclusion is with gratitude as well. I could not have dreamed several years ago that I would find a forum within which to discuss these ideas. So thanks to each of you for taking the time to come out, and feel free to be in touch over email or messenger if you have further follow-up ideas. But and thanks for each member of the planning committee and to Becca for coordinating us.
Yes, we will be hosting more of these events. The next date has not been set, so watch this space. We will flood your inboxes with invitations as soon as we can say more. Thank you.